Yeah, today I guess we're going to be doing a bit of a refresher on the Wingman concept, getting people more communicative within their wing. I mean, yeah, obviously Wiki will go into further detail, but it's all about keeping in sight of, or at least knowing where your wingman is, what he's doing, and talking back and forth, supporting each other when needed, and such like that.
Thank you, Saker. So, yep, like Saker said, we're going to be discussing the wingman concept today. And sort of the fundamental idea behind the concept is that in an air combat environment, whether it's a modern air combat environment like we have in DCS, or if you're simulating something back in World War II or anywhere in between, there's just too much information that you as an air crew need to keep track of for each person to do it all themselves. You have to divide up that work. And so what follows then is that there is a division of responsibility between each member of a flight. And together you form a single air crew that ideally is able to coordinate to accomplish tasks that would be much more difficult for each of you to do individually. Yes, this was originally prepared by Hex for the 93rd, but I think the concepts, a lot of them apply more broadly to the other squadrons, and certainly some of the details do as well. So we'll dive right into it. In this, we're going to be talking about, first of all, wingman expectations, because that's sort of the basic level of applying the wingman concept. And those expectations are generally pretty much the same regardless of aircraft type. And then after that, we're going to be talking about element leader expectations or flight leader expectations, which are broadly the same. And then applications of each of those into tactics for different combat environments, whether it's seed or air-to-air or air-to-ground. First of all, let's talk about wingmen. The number one thing that a wingman needs to do is keep track of where their flight lead is and stick with them. Now, we're not talking about literally staying in close formation with them and following their maneuvers, as impressive as it was that, what was his name, Samuel, was able to do with Cortana the other day. But we are talking about staying close enough that you can see them with your eyes and are able to give them some assurance that you're going to be there for them when they need you to do something, or that you can see threats to your flight, such as an enemy fighter coming behind you or a SAM launching at your element lead, and be able to provide warning to them when that happens. And so that's the number one goal that you have, is you want to keep your element lead visually in sight at all times. And in order to do that, you're probably going to need to just be constantly shifting your gaze between your element lead and your instruments. And you're going to need to go back and forth every couple of seconds so that you don't lose sight of your element lead. Now, the second responsibility that you have is to build situational awareness for your flight. What that entails is you need to be paying attention not just to your flight lead or your element lead, but to what's going on around you. You're not so much concerned about navigation, because that's more of your element lead's responsibilities. You're more concerned about looking for threats, looking for enemy aircraft, looking for ground targets, things of that nature. And so if you're in an aircraft with a radar, you're going to be using that radar, sort of paying attention to it to see if anything pops up, paying attention to your data link if you have one. If you're in an A10, then you're going to be looking for SAM launches, looking for basically anything that could potentially be a threat on the ground. When you're close to an objective, you're going to be using your sensors to try to identify targets, unless your element lead has taken that responsibility. You're going to be monitoring comms, but you're not going to be communicating with other elements or other flights. pretty much the only person you're going to be talking to directly is your element lead. You're responsible for paying attention in the briefing so that you know what the flight plan is and what your objectives are. And you're responsible for knowing what your element's role in the overall mission is. Does anybody have any questions about that or want me to go into any further detail? Okay, great. Let's talk about element leaders or flight leaders. They're essentially interchangeable in our group. The element leader needs to maintain a shared mental model with other elements. Essentially what that means is that you need to be paying attention in the briefing and you need to know what you're supposed to do. You need to make sure that you ask the questions you need to ask in order to clear up any confusion that you have during the planning phase of the mission. Once you have established that mental model, you need to do whatever you have to do to maintain that, to try not to get confused, because air combat can be a very confusing environment. There's a lot of things that can distract you, and you have to focus on trying to manage those distractions. So as a flight lead, you need to maintain your awareness of what you're doing and what you're supposed to be doing, and try not to get distracted by every little thing that comes up. And you need to, when necessary, you need to delegate responsibility for using sensors or other things to your wingman. Part of your role is also to build SA, but you build it in a different way than your wingman. Rather than defaulting to using your eyes, looking for threats, using your sensors, your SA is more focused on paying attention to communications, knowing where everyone else is, knowing where you are, and where you are in terms of navigation. And you need to be prepared to modify your plan as circumstances change around you. And then finally, like I was alluding to earlier, you need to be directing and delegating tasks to your wingman. This starts right from the very beginning. You ideally want to be talking to your wingman before you even take off to establish your contract with them, to say, these are the things that I expect you to do. These are the things that I want you to do at this phase of flight and then at this other phase of flight, so on and so forth. And just make sure that you guys are absolutely on the same page, because you don't know if your wingman was here in this training tonight. So it's up to you to make sure that you communicate to them what you want them to do. Moving right along, I think we can skip seed. Does anyone want to talk about seed other than people in the 93rd?
I'll go over it when there's more Vigans here, because
Fair
we
enough.
do a little bit.
We'll talk about BVR since we have some Mirage folks in here. So BVR and air combat in general is, the tactics around it are largely focused on supporting and engaged fighters. What that means essentially is that in your two-ship element, you've got one fighter that is engaged and one fighter that is supporting. So you've got a fighter that is taking the Fox 1 shot, and the other one is basically just covering them, watching for additional threats, and will provide directive comms to the engaged fighter to help them survive any threat that pops up at them. An example of that would be, so let's say, in this example, let's say Cortana and Toretto are in an element, and they come across a pair of MiGs, and Cortana takes a Fox 1 shot at a MiG. And then Toretto, who is covering, sees a SAM pop up off the ground, an IR SAM towards Cortana. And so she's going to give a directive comm to Cortana, break right in order to evade that SAM. When we're talking about directive comms, they're a little bit different from how I guess a lot of us have practiced comms in DCS world, where we follow the standard algorithm of, we say our call sign, then their call sign, or rather their call sign, then our call sign, and then a message, and then wait for a response. Directive comms, you just say what you want to say. Just say break right, or evade, or chaff, flare. Just get the message out, and they just allow them to trust you. So moving back to the supporting and engaged tactics, supporting fighter, like I said, is covering the engaged fighter, while the engaged fighter is going to be engaging the threat directly. And if the engaged fighter gets into a situation where they no longer have an advantage, or they need to turn away for whatever reason, such as they're getting close to Mar and they're leaving the BVR arena, then the supporting fighter, if they're able, should take over and continue to press their advantage if they have one against the hostile. Ideally, you want to be communicating this plan with each other at any points that you possibly can, from takeoff all the way up to when you actually get engaged. And this applies both to BVR and if you get within visual range. Supporting an engaged fighter within visual range stuff, I'm sure Cortana is very familiar with it. You want to have your supporting fighter try not to get decisively engaged in a turn fight with a hostile. Rather, they should sort of fly up above and maintain visual custody of both their wingman and whatever they're engaged with, and see if they can find an opportunity to come in and snipe a kill, is essentially what it boils down to. And finally, we'll talk about air-to-ground tactics, and this, I guess, will pertain largely to the A10s. Once again, supporting and engaged tactics apply here. In the case of A10s, when you guys are coming in on a target, you guys are going to be deconflicted in some sort of way. Either you're going to be in a trail formation or in a wide, like combat spread sort of formation, where whoever is engaged is able to focus specifically on the ground target and employing their weapons on it. And that's all they should care about while they're employing their weapons. They should be entirely focused on killing that damn thing that's on the ground that needs to be dead right now. Whereas the supporting fighter, their whole job is to just pay attention to what's going on around the engaged fighter and tell them if they need to break right now because there's a SAM coming at them. It's a relationship that requires some trust, and it requires communication and establishing that contract before you guys get into combat. Along with those things, you should probably discuss, depending on what weapons you have, how you're going to use them, what direction you're going to approach from, what formation you're going to attack in, whether you're going to attack in a trail formation, one after the other, or, as I think probably pertains a little bit better to A10s, if you're going to come in a line abreast formation and then hit the target one after the other. And then you're going to want to make sure that you guys agree on whatever directive comms you're going to use, such as, break, chaff, flare, anything of that nature, that you need to be absolutely as concise as possible.
You got this part, Luca, because I think this
I'm recording this just because,
okay,
I'm not going to remember everything, so I'm going to record it because I'm bad at taking notes, and then I can go through it again, and hopefully I'll post it as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess for the recording, this free engage thing is, I think, the most powerful tool for the A10s right now.
Does anybody have any questions about what I've gone over thus far? Because this is pretty much it as far as the notes that I have.
Well, okay, for example, let's say we have an element of A10s, and we would want one attacking the target while another one is either orbiting overhead while watching, or they want to be at the IP, essentially, if we're attacking from a certain direction, and then just sitting there while they watch the other one engage, right?
No, generally not. So the way that this is typically going to work for an air-to-ground engagement, and I wish I had access to the stuff that Shepard made for this. It's probably lying around somewhere. I just don't know where it is. But basically, you guys are going to come in towards the target in a line abreast formation, typically. And whoever is the engaged fighter is going to be going not quite straight at the target, but at a bit of an offset, so that right at the last moment they can roll in on the target and employ their weapons. Whereas the other fighter is going to be a couple of miles on the outside of that. say if the target's on the left, then the supporting fighter is going to be on the right side of the engaged fighter, right? And like a couple of miles offset, so that they have a good chance of seeing any SAMs that pop up at the engaged fighter. And you guys are going to be in line abreast so that you can clearly see each other and any threats that pop up in either direction.
Okay, so the question I would have then is, so if I'm understanding you right, basically we have a sort of staggered formation, because I'm looking at a line abreast formation right now. You have the lead fighter, right, going in,
Yes.
going for the attack run. Then we have another one, which is your element wing, about 2 miles back to the right or left, but most likely to the right. And they're watching. Do they then make an attack run after the lead finishes, or what is the idea there?
That's a great question. So what you typically want to do is perform some sort of synchronized attack or a time deconflicted attack. So what that basically means, it sounds a lot more complicated than it really is, but what it basically amounts to is the fight lead, or the first engaged fighter, is going to make their first pass, employ their weapons, and then pull up and evade AAA, right? And then once they do their evasion, they're going to continue on some sort of heading that you two agreed on beforehand, which is probably just going to be continuing in the same direction you started in, right? And so
they wouldn't really want to overfly the target zone, though.
Well, you're not intended to actually overfly the target.
Oh, okay.
So like, in my previous example, you made a left turn, rolled in, employed weapons, made a right turn and evaded back out, rejoined on the supporting fighter, and then continued in the same direction, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're then going to do after that is the entire flight is going to make basically a 120-degree turn to the left. And then the supporting fighter is now going to be the engaged fighter, and you guys are going to swap roles. All right, so apologies for the delay here, but here's a graphic depiction of time deconflicted echelon. So in this case, this is an example where they actually do overfly the target. But what it basically amounts to is you're flying on a line that is sort of intended to fly past the target. The lead is going to roll in, hit the target, and then evade or overfly or do whatever it is they're going to do. But ultimately, they're going to reach this point, and then at a point when both the lead and the wingman agree, they're going to start a turn down towards basically opposite from where they started, and the wingman's going to hit the target.
Is this air to air or is this air to ground?
This is air to ground.
Okay.
Cal, I think this is what we should try doing today. Damn, he's dead.
I think there's a bunch of this stuff in the F-16, the South Korean Air Force manual as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably where Shepard got these from, honestly. Oh, here's another great example. This one's probably more pertinent to the A-10s, I think.
So the wingman does in fact attack as well.
Oh yeah,
same run.
But yeah, the
Not
bottom
on the
line
same
is
run.
the bottom line is that they don't attack simultaneously.
Yeah, they're staggered, but they both attack.
They're staggered,
Basically,
but generally they both
waits
attack
until the lead has visual on the target area in case there's SAM launches, so he can watch the wingman attack as well, right?
Exactly. Like you want to make a verbal exchange of the roles, such as when you start your first attack, the lead is going to say 2 cover, and 2 is going to say 2, and then you guys are going to roll in. Lead's going to employ, and then whatever you guys do after that point, at some point 2 is going to say they're rolling in, and lead's going to say lead's covering, and then that's the verbal acknowledgement that those contractual roles have reversed between supporting and engaged, because whoever's supporting is going to be covering, right?
Yeah. And okay, so this is I don't want to get us off track, but I feel like this might be relevant. So, in a hypothetical, we have two A10s attacking a target. This target has Iglas on it, right?
Yes.
So the wing, like while the lead is attacking, the wing is watching for Sam threats firing, right? Let's say if Sam fires, the lead dodges the missile. It's then the wingman's job to know where that Sam came from and kill it on its attack run. Or, well, I guess.
Yeah.
So that is an interpretation of what you can do. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's always the wingman's responsibility to do that. That is something that you could incorporate in your crew contract with
That would
whoever
be
your element member
if we
is.
couldn't find the Iglas, that would be a way of dealing with them.
It would be.
And sometimes, like, for example, me and Bean will purposefully, like, we'll go in, like, a couple miles trail, and he'll be behind me, and I'll pop up and try to bait, like, an SA-8 or something to shoot at me. And when it shoots at me, I go defensive, and he pops up and shoots it with a Maverick. So that is, like, a kind of example of, like, free engage, not necessarily time deconflicted, but I mean, it's all about, like, yeah, what you intend to do, and just make sure you make it clear to your wingman what you're doing.
Yeah.
Work together. You're stronger together.
Yeah, that's what it basically boils down to. And like, just by default, you should just not be thinking you should not be both trying to attack a target at the same time, right? Because that means that one of you isn't paying attention to other stuff that's going on.
Now, there are exceptions to the rule, and I don't know if the A-10s will ever do it, but like in airfield strike, for example, I mean, no, probably the A-10s will never do this, but the Vigans very much have to. We all have to attack at the same time, because that increases our chances of survival. Like when you're just directly overflying through AAA, you don't really want to go in one by one. That's just the nature of the Vigan, though. So
I feel like
guess
the
it's not
best
really
way to
relevant.
describe that would just be these are guidelines, not hard and fast rules. You should adapt to
Right.
the situation.
Yeah, you
Absolutely.
definitely want to adapt to the situation, but at the end of the day, no matter what you do, like work with your wingman and make sure like everyone's on the same page before you get into the threat zone.
Yeah, and even in the example that Saker gave, like there's almost certainly going to be a delineation of tasks between different members of a single element. It may just be as simple as one person is carrying the ordnance while the other person is carrying the countermeasures.
Yeah. Perhaps.
Yeah, so that's just big in life, I guess. But are there any other questions about that? Does anybody feel really kind of uneasy about this, or does everybody feel like they have something that they can try to put into practice?
I have one question.
Yeah.
What happens when all that planning is, not fine, but you get punched in the mouth? Everybody is kind of lost. Nobody knows where their wingman is. How are you supposed to, I guess, regroup? Is it up to the wingman to say that they're blind and they need to rendezvous somewhere, or what?
Great
Drop a
question.
flare or
It is always the wingman's responsibility to say that they're blind.
Okay.
So they are the one. The wingman is always responsible for getting formed back up with their flight lead.
Now, keep in mind though, if the wingman role is something that you can hand off, if the lead is spectating the wingman's run and loses sight of the wingman, he needs to let the wingman know. Like, wingman doesn't necessarily mean number two.
Gotcha.
Right. The supporting fighter, if we've gotten into actual combat, the supporting fighter always needs to keep sight of the engaged fighter. Then that's where the responsibility lies. But in general, it is whoever's in the wingman role. They need to make sure that they're keeping their lead in sight and that they also have a method for rejoining if they get separated. And that method may involve data link or air-to-air TACAN or any number of things.
Going back to B1.
Yeah.
Well, I think that covered everything I wanted it to cover. Are there any further questions? Alrighty. Luca, we're going to go down. You're gonna pretend to be, or the Vigans are gonna pretend to be an A10 today, and you're gonna join us, and we're gonna work together with you, since I don't think there's other A10s flying right now. But everyone else, like, feel free to split into your own flights, and we can put this to the test.
Before we separate, I do want to
Yes.
make another point about communications, which is brevity. And not just, what brevity terms are, but just like the whole concept of being of having brevity when you're talking on the radio, because this plays into the difference between interrogative and directive comms. Because directive comms, like I was saying earlier, things like break right, chaff flare, that also, in a sense, sort of extends to making calls for weapons employment. Like, if you're in an area with a group of fighters and you're employing weapons, like, I don't think anyone really cares who is doing the employing. Nobody needs to hear you say, like, missed 1-1 Fox 1, whatever. Just say Fox 1. People know that there's a missile in the air, and to be on the lookout or watch their raw gear to make sure it's not for them, right? And it just helps keep the radio chatter a little bit less than it would otherwise be. And I'd recommend to some of you guys who haven't, listen to real life recordings of things like MiG shoot downs in the Gulf War, for things like that, because they kind of display that sort of mentality in those recordings. So that's all I have on that.
Cool. Thanks, Wiki.